Power in ancient Rome had a funny habit of tripping over its own toga and landing in the lap of someone unexpected. Take Claudius, for example. He basically stumbled into the imperial throne after Caligula got the Julius Caesar treatment. And along with him came his young wife, Messalina, who at barely 20 found herself Empress of Rome. Did she ease into the role gently? Absolutely not. Messalina hit the ground running, not as some demure imperial +1, but as a political powerhouse wrapped in silk and scandal. With youthful charm and a brain sharp enough to slice through senatorial nonsense, she set out to build her own empire from inside the empire. Rome expected its empress to be a model of virtue, grace, and modesty. Messalina, on the other hand, looked at that checklist and said, "Hard pass." She wasn't interested in being the woman behind the man. She wanted to be the one pulling the strings, covertly, strategically, and occasionally seductively. In a court full of secrets, she spoke fluent intrigue. She made allies, forged pacts, whispered sweet threats, and built her influence like it was a palace of its own. And let's just say, her fame didn't stop at politics. According to ancient historians, many of whom seem to have an axe to grind and a flair for tabloid-style drama, Messalina wasn't just ambitious, she was Rome's original scandal magnet. They accused her of sneaking out of the palace at night, working incognito at brothels, and outperforming the professionals, only to return at dawn like nothing happened. Now, were these stories true? Or the fever dreams of grumpy Roman men who didn't like powerful women? Hard to say. But one thing's for sure, her reputation wasn't built on modesty. Even her lovers weren't just for pleasure, they were strategic acquisitions. Senators, nobles, heirs to influential families. Messalina didn't just use politics to get ahead, she used pillow talk like some people use campaign speeches. Get in bed with her, and your career might skyrocket. Cross her, you might wake up halfway to exile or not wake up at all. Meanwhile, Emperor Claudius, well, he either didn't know, didn't want to know, or pretended not to know. He was busy with reforms, paperwork, and surviving Rome's deadly version of office politics. Some say Messalina played the part of the innocent wife so convincingly that he believed it. Others think he preferred blissful ignorance over a very inconvenient reality. But the rest of Rome, oh, Rome knew. And in those glittering, gossip-fueled halls, Messalina carved her name into history, not just as an empress, but as a legend, a cautionary tale, a master manipulator, and perhaps, depending on who you ask, the most dangerously captivating woman the empire ever saw. Imagine trying to run an entire kingdom while perched atop a pair of seriously infected meat sacks. That was Henry's daily grind. His leg sores weren't just painful, they were the stuff of legends. Visitors could smell them from across the room. Ambassadors dreaded court meetings, not because of political drama, but because breathing near his ankles was basically a biohazard warning. Rumor had it, the ulcers were so deep you could practically see bone. The word ooze might as well have been Henry's theme song, popping up in letters left and right. If Shakespeare had written a horror play about the human body, this would have been Act 1. Naturally, the finest 16th century medical experts were summoned, which basically meant they slapped herbs on the wounds and prayed really hard. Their treatment toolkit? Honey, rose oil, and whatever else sounded vaguely church-approved. They even tried cauterization, burning the wounds shut, which Henry definitely did not enjoy. Then came the lancing. Oh, the lancing, a daily torture ritual involving blades and cloths to drain the ulcers. Imagine being the royal doctor showing up every morning like, "Good morning, Your Majesty. Time to stab your legs again." No wonder so many court doctors died young, probably from sheer trauma. The ulcers made exercise nearly impossible, which, combined with Henry's famously indulgent diet, created a vicious cycle. More weight meant more pressure on the wounds, more pressure meant more pain meant mood swings, and more mood swings meant someone nearby was probably getting fired, exiled, or, worst of all, remarried. If you've ever wondered what happens when a man tries to eat his way into sainthood or straight out of reality, look no further than Henry's daily menu. His meals weren't just excessive, they were practically weapons of mass consumption. Breakfast alone could include several eggs, giant chunks of beef, white bread soaked in ale, and maybe a roasted partridge just to get things moving. Fruits and veggies, only if they accidentally fell onto the roast or were there for decoration. At this court, meat was manhood. The more flesh on your plate, the more divine your rule. Henry, bless him, took this as a personal challenge. Roasted swan, venison, lamb, eel pies, game birds, each slathered in gravy, sauce, or symbolic meaning. A carnivore's dream, if that dream came with a side of agony. He wrote, "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." Poetic, sure, but not exactly the kind of thing you slap on a Hallmark card. After he was released from prison, he sent that line in a letter to the man who had once meant the world to him. But let's just say the friendship didn't survive the fallout. The damage had been done, the recipient emotionally checked out, the sender broke, disgraced, and ultimately died in exile with heartbreak for company. That letter, De Profundis, didn't even see the light of day in its full form until both men had exited stage left. And no, it's not your standard "I miss you, boo" type of love letter. It's more like love's post-mortem, less Cupid, more existential crisis. It's not about passion, it's about what love takes with it when it packs up and leaves. Raw, devastating, honest enough to make your spine ache. Fast forward to another literary legend, Virginia Woolf. Ah, Virginia, intellectual powerhouse, stream of consciousness queen, master of quietly unraveling minds, starting with her own. On paper, she had the perfect setup. A devoted husband, Leonard, who supported her through every mental storm and writer's block. But real life, like great novels, loves a twist. Enter Vita Sackville West, aristocrat, writer, free spirit with a dash of chaos, their relationship. A genre-defying roller coaster of brainy flirtation, emotional intensity, romantic heat, and occasional physical sparks. It kicked off in the 1920s and unfolded through letters that still make modern readers feel like they're eavesdropping on something too private and too beautiful for this world. In one of her first letters, Vita confesses, "I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia. It is incredible how essential to me you have become." Yup. Not just a crush, this was full-blown emotional combustion. The roles often flipped. Virginia, usually buttoned up and wary, turned into the one yearning, aching, crumbling into poetic pieces. Her letters were a delicate cocktail of dry wit, barely contained desire, and a kind of longing that oozes between the lines rather than shouts from them. Vita wasn't just a lover, she was a revelation. Virginia saw in her a wildness, a dazzling kind of womanhood that she both wanted and wanted to be. That obsession birthed Orlando, a novel about a time-hopping, gender-bending hero who was, in every sense, Vita on the page. It wasn't just fiction, It was an encrypted love letter masquerading as a literary experiment. And Vita, oh, she loved Virginia too, though not exclusively. She had a rotating cast of lovers, a husband of her own, and the emotional availability of a weather vane. But her letters to Virginia pulsed with sincerity. She once wrote, "I miss you even more than I could have believed, and I was prepared to miss you a good deal." Translation: this wasn't just a fling, this was gravitational. What makes their letters so magical isn't just what they said, it's what they didn't say out loud. These weren't romantic fireworks, they were whispered embers, private, coded, drenched in nuance. Even after the romance cooled, their bond stayed warm, writing back and forth until Virginia's tragic death in 1941. Her final letter to Leonard, her husband, often gets quoted. It's heartbreaking, but her letters to Vita, that's where her spirit dances, vulnerable, luminous, undeniably alive. In a world that kept trying to jam love into tidy boxes, Virginia and Vita shredded the packaging and scribbled their own messy, magnificent love story in the margins. Their letters didn't just talk about love, they were love, complicated, electric, uncategorizable, just like them. Instead of facing his troubles head-on, Henry took a decidedly more aromatic approach. He piled on powders, oils, and enough layers of rich fabric to make a mattress jealous, all in a desperate bid to soak up the shame and the stench. Basically, he turned himself into a velvet and linen mummy, praying no one would notice what was rotting underneath. Spoiler alert, they noticed, big time. His clothes were so toxic they had to be burned after one wear. Washing was apparently out of the question, a fitting symbol for how much of his dignity had gone down the drain. Yet no one dared mention any of this in his royal presence. Even the faintest grimace or raised eyebrow could earn you an impromptu trip to the Tower of London or, worse, a job changing his bandages. Yes, that was a real gig. We don't know the names of those brave souls, but let's take a moment to honor their courage. Being king is hard enough, but being a king who's constantly in agony, oozing from every imaginable orifice and slowly sinking into your own throne, that's next level misery. By the time Henry VIII's reign was winding down, he wasn't just physically stuck. Emotionally, he was a ticking time bomb. One minute, he'd be bawling over his late wife's memory, the next, accusing someone of treason for blinking too loudly. His court lived in a state of perpetual psychological whiplash. The servants became experts at reading the subtle cues. The tilt of an eyebrow was as ominous as storm clouds to sailors. He's frowning. Brace yourselves. It's either constipation or war. Of course, Henry hadn't always been this way. Back in the day, he was charismatic, smart, and downright playful. But as his ulcers worsened, so did his mood swings. The charming young king was replaced by a volatile ruler whose main foreign policy was rage. Medical historians suspect that alongside his many physical woes, he probably dealt with untreated depression, constant pain-induced irritability, and maybe even some head trauma from a jousting accident in 1536. But in 16th century England, the cure for a bad mood was either prayer, leeches, or blaming the French. And since he was the king, no one dared tell him to just take a day off. Instead, his advisors smiled nervously and nodded along to whatever he said. Some even called his fiery temper divinely inspired, which is a fancy way of saying, "We'd like to keep our heads, thank you very much." The fallout? A royal mess. Dozens of courtiers were exiled, locked up, or executed just for being on the wrong side of one of Henry's emotional hurricanes. Even his longtime pal and chancellor wasn't safe, proving the king's inner circle was more like a revolving door. By January 1547, everyone at court knew the end was near, everyone except Henry himself. Instead of dealing with his problems head-on, Henry turned to powders, oils, and enough layers of fancy fabrics to make a medieval mummy jealous. He basically wrapped himself up in velvet and linen like a walking, groaning casserole, hoping nobody would notice the smell coming from underneath. Spoiler alert, everyone noticed. Even his clothes had it rough. They were so gross they had to be burned after one use, not washed. A perfect metaphor for how much of his dignity was now just trash. Yet no one dared mention any of this to his face. One wrong nose wrinkle and boom. You might find yourself relocated to a less cozy place called the Tower of London, or worse, stuck with the glamorous job of changing his bandages. Yes, that was a real job. We don't know who those poor souls were, but they deserve a moment of silence. Seriously, being a king is tough enough. Being a king who's in constant agony, leaking from multiple orifices and slowly becoming one with his throne. Next level nightmare. By the end of his reign, Henry wasn't just stuck in his chair. His emotions were all over the place like a soap opera on steroids. One minute, he'd be sobbing over his late wife's memory. The next, accusing someone of treason for blinking too loudly. The royal court basically lived in a state of whiplash, with servants learning to read his eyebrow twitches like sailors watching for storm clouds. Uh-oh, that frown means either constipation or war. Of course, Henry hadn't always been this tragic figure. Back in the day, he was charming, smart, and even a bit playful. But as his ulcers got worse, so did his mood swings. The once vibrant king turned into a ticking time bomb whose main diplomatic strategy was just rage. Medical experts today think he was probably dealing with untreated depression, chronic pain that made him cranky, and maybe a concussion from a jousting accident. But in the 16th century England, the cure for a bad mood was either prayer, leeches, or blaming the French, because that always helps. Being king meant no one could just tell him to chill out. Instead, his advisors smiled through gritted teeth and nodded like, "Yes, Your Majesty's anger is absolutely divine." Translation: "We'd like to keep our heads attached, thank you very much." The outcome: a royal bloodbath. Courtiers were exiled, imprisoned, or executed just for being in the wrong mood zone when Henry's temper hit hurricane levels. Even his best friend and top chancellor wasn't safe, proving Henry's inner circle was more like a revolving door. By January 1547, everyone at court knew the end was near, everyone except Henry himself. He was falling apart in every conceivable way, but heaven forbid you say that out loud. Under Tudor law, predicting the king's death wasn't just rude, it was treason, which turned royal physicians into the most nervous, overqualified thespians in the kingdom. Henry wasn't just bedridden, he had moved in. The bed was his kingdom now. He hadn't walked in weeks, hadn't ridden a horse in years, and was now ruling England from deep within a fortress of decorative pillows and increasingly questionable life choices. His legs were swollen, his breathing sounded like a winded accordion. His appetite had declined, although by Tudor standards, that still meant eating enough to scare the kitchen staff. He was clearly on his way out, but the mere suggestion was a career-ending offence. So instead of stating the obvious, everyone got creative. courtiers rolled out a euphemism parade. The king is resting deeply. His Majesty is in a contemplative state. He's just digesting, with enthusiasm. Even the doctors did linguistic gymnastics. One supposedly said, "His Majesty shall recover, God willing," which is physician speak, for we're all doomed, but please don't arrest me. It was vague, non-committal, and conveniently outsourced the prognosis to the Almighty. Meanwhile, His Majesty was drifting in and out of consciousness, likely hallucinating about roast goose, religious reform, and a life with fewer ulcers. But paperwork waits for no man, not even one disintegrating by the hour. So he kept at it, signing documents, tweaking his will, and setting up a regency council for his 9-year-old son, Edward, who was about to inherit a throne, a divided country, and a national debt large enough to qualify as a European landmass. These were not the grand, final acts of a majestic ruler. These were scribbled orders from a man whose body was in full retreat, while everyone around him pretended he just needed a nap. The truth was plain. Servants knew, courtiers knew, even the rats under the floorboards probably sensed something historical was about to happen, but no one dared say it, because the king couldn't die until it was officially safe to let him. And absolutely no one wanted to be the first to call it. So January dragged on. Henry hovered somewhere between regal lucidity and full-blown royal fever dream. His body was waving the white flag, but his brain was still issuing royal decrees, snubbing enemies and playing pretend like a professional. The denial in that palace was thicker than his ankles, and that truly is saying something. He didn't go out with a grand speech, a tearful goodbye, or a dramatic "remember me." He didn't even manage a decent groan. Instead, he spent his final days bossing people around, editing his will like a royal Google Doc, fiddling with the Regency Council, and reshuffling political players in case someone got any bright ideas once he kicked the royal bucket, which, for the record, he insisted wasn't happening anytime soon. Most importantly, he nailed down the line of succession. The crown was going to his 9-year-old son, Edward, a lad with the constitution of a damp crumpet, who'd be supported by a hand-picked gang of advisors. Think less wise elders and more Game of Thrones with ruffles and slightly better table manners. Their loyalty was about as reliable as a cat's mood. Oh, and the tomb. He ordered that thing finished once and for all, a grand, glorious mausoleum he'd been daydreaming about for decades. Naturally, it was never completed. For all his obsession with control, the only thing that actually survived him was the avalanche of paperwork. On religion, he managed to maintain a masterclass in ambiguity. England stayed kinda Protestant, but not too Protestant, just enough to tick off the Pope while keeping things spiritually vague. It was like shouting a theological insult under your breath and bolting before anyone could respond. Even with death breathing down his neck like a nosy aunt, he refused to admit anything was wrong. When priests showed up offering him a last chance chat with God, he dodged them like they were handing out unpaid internships. One source claims he finally muttered, "All is lost." Cryptic. Was he talking about his soul, his realm, or the turkey leg someone probably dropped under the bed? Meanwhile, the palace was running on a strict "don't say he's dying" policy. Using phrases like last rites or funeral prep got you escorted out faster than you could say heir apparent. Not because it was rude, because it shattered the official fantasy that their king wasn't quietly disintegrating like a wet cake. And in true royal drama fashion, you'd expect Henry to bow out with a majestic soliloquy, maybe something about love, betrayal, his suspiciously short list of surviving spouses. Instead, we got admin, cold, efficient, oddly punctual admin. Yes, there were priests at his bedside, but they were basically spiritual decor. This was the same man who created an entire national church so he could unmarry his wives at will and dabble in theology like it was a pub quiz. Yet at the end, silence. No dramatic cries for mercy. No tender apologies to Mary for executing her mum. Just nothing. Maybe he thought he'd done nothing wrong. This was a man who truly believed that God was his co-pilot, and that any turbulence was the fault of the Pope, a few inconvenient wives, and some extremely uncooperative relatives. According to one account, the Archbishop showed up and asked if he still trusted in Christ. Henry, barely conscious, gave a little hand squeeze. Was it a yes, a twitch, a royal version of "don't touch me unless you've got a drink in your other hand"? We'll never know. But that was the closest thing he ever gave to a final confession. So in the end, while other kings went out with regrets and prayers, Henry went out doing what he loved best, controlling the narrative, shuffling the paperwork, and delegating like an overworked CEO. He didn't repent, he reorganized. Once upon a time, there was a man who called himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Bold move, really. But when death finally knocked on his door, he answered it with all the ceremony of someone vaguely acknowledging a waiter. One nod, one twitch of the hand, and that was it. No holy send-off, no divine fireworks. Turns out, absolute authority does not come with an afterlife briefing. But honestly, what could be more him? No regrets, no monks sobbing in the wings, just the slow, inevitable unraveling of a guy who'd always preferred writing new laws to listening to that pesky inner voice called a conscience. So Henry VIII exited stage left on January 28, 1547, with no famous last words, no tragic monologue, and definitely no sign that he thought anything had gone remotely sideways. When he finally gave up the ghost, the reaction was underwhelming. Not because people didn't care, but because nobody was legally allowed to say anything. You see, thanks to the thrilling world of Tudor legislation, proclaiming the king was dead, even if he was literally dead right in front of you, was considered treason. Yes, that's right. Everyone in the room suddenly became very invested in pretending that His Majesty was just taking an aggressively long nap. Doctors, priests, and assorted yes-men stared at each other in a tense silence, each hoping someone else would risk decapitation first. Nobody did. There was no grand announcement, no national mourning, no public sorrow, just the heavy, awkward pause of people thinking, now what? In the end, they settled on a cunning plan, do absolutely nothing for a few days, not out of reverence, mind you, but pure, cold political strategy. The transition of power had to be managed, and first, on the to-do list, was telling a 9-year-old that he now owned an entire kingdom, including a fair number of political enemies. Meanwhile, Henry's body lingered at Whitehall Palace, still technically king, though now more symbolic than functional. Ministers bustled about, pretending he was indisposed, which, to be fair, wasn't technically a lie, just a heroic understatement. Mourning clothes were quietly ordered. Official seals got a subtle makeover. Somewhere, an ambitious noble probably dusted off an old family tree, suddenly remembering he was the distant cousin of the new child monarch and, therefore, owed a castle, or 3. Foreign diplomats weren't clued in right away. Ambassadors from France and the Holy Roman Empire continued diplomatic pleasantries, with increasingly tense courtiers who smiled too hard while trying not to breathe through their noses, because by this point the scent of decomposing royalty had begun to gently waft through the palace, like an especially tragic potpourri. Legally, the kingdom was still being run by a man who was, let's say, quiet. Not moving, not talking, not especially fresh, but definitely still king, on paper. And then, of course, came the next royal dilemma. What to do with the body? Because unfortunately the body had its own opinions, namely it had decided to decompose at a speed normally reserved for unrefrigerated seafood. Let's be blunt, Henry VIII was enormous. We're talking 300 pounds of monarch and not a toned, gym-sculpted 300. More of a collapsing souffle in silk leggings. Add to that a cocktail of chronic infections, oozing leg ulcers, and a lifetime of banquet-level indulgence, and, well, biology started doing its thing faster than expected. In the icy halls of Whitehall, servants and embalmers launched into action. Sadly, this was not a golden age for corpse preservation. The process involved stuffing the king's considerable remains with spices and wrapping him in enough cloth to qualify as a human holiday roast, the hope that cinnamon and cloves might drown out the rising funk of royal decay. Spoiler alert, they did not. Despite everyone's best intentions, the royal remains began to leak. Slowly at first, just a regal trickle, but soon things took a turn for the grotesque. Bodily fluids seeped through the coffin like a scene from a Tudor horror show, making the atmosphere at the funeral somewhere between confused, disgusted, and who brought the bucket. As the procession made its way to Windsor, the coffin didn't just carry a king, it carried a dark, smelly surprise. Reports claim a sinister stain began to spread, accompanied by an odour so offensive it startled the horses. Yes, startled the horses. And in a tale so bizarre it demands belief, the smell allegedly lured in a pack of stray dogs. Not mourners, dogs, who began licking the royal runoff. It's safe to say this was not how the late monarch envisioned his final send-off, as a dog buffet on the side of the road. The problem? The coffin had been slapped together in a rush. Urgency took precedence over, say, structural integrity. Internal gases built up like an unloved science project, swelling the wood until it cracked. Imagine a very regal Tupperware container, but without the airtight seal, and with a lot more king juice. The courtiers kept their expressions noble and their comments non-existent. Nobody wanted to be the first to say, "Does anyone else smell Henry?" Dignity demanded silence. Even as the scent of royal stew wafted through the air, they marched on, heads high, nostrils wide open, deeply regretting their career choices. You'd think a figure as larger than life as this particular monarch would at least travel to the grave in a majestic, marble-lined casket. Instead, his remains were ferried around in something that reacted like a bloated roast left too long in the sun, a leaky, swelling historical hazard, because nothing says eternal legacy like a coffin that melts. Contemporary observers, ever the polite chroniclers, described a black, putrid liquid oozing from the base of the coffin during a stop at Sion Abbey. It's the kind of memory that sticks with you, haunts you, possibly ruins soup forever. And yes, the infamous dog story pops up again. According to one version, dubious but far too delicious not to repeat, local dogs were caught enthusiastically sampling the royal leakage. Picture it, a solemn parade, nobles in full mourning gear, and a couple of scrappy mutts feasting on history. It's the kind of moment no royal protocol manual prepares you for, but no one said a word. The show must go on even when the star is leaking through the floorboards. They wiped up what they could, kept marching, and never mentioned it again. Not in public, anyway. Centuries later, the tale lives on, a grim, oozing anecdote whispered by historians with strong stomachs. Because if there's one thing this monarch refused to do in life or death, it was go quietly. Power in Rome had a funny habit of falling into the wrong lap at just the right moment. When Emperor Caligula met his untimely, and let's be honest, not entirely unwelcome, end, the empire found itself in chaos. Amid the confusion, a nervous, stammering Claudius somehow stumbled into the throne, literally pulled out from behind a curtain, hiding for dear life. And just like that, a new empress took center stage, a 20-something named Messalina. Now, most people would need a minute to settle into the role of Empress of Rome, not Messalina. She slid into that power like she'd been born wearing a laurel wreath. From day one, she wasn't interested in playing the supportive arm candy role. She had ambition, and lots of it. With charm on the surface and a mind sharp enough to cut marble, she started weaving her web, not to decorate the palace, but to trap her enemies. Rome liked its empresses demure, modest, the kind who stood behind the emperor and smiled sweetly during speeches. Messalina? She had her own script. She wanted to be the puppeteer, pulling strings with a wicked combination of flattery, seduction, alliances, and just enough menace to keep people checking their backs. In a palace where secrets flowed more freely than wine, Messalina was fluent in whispers. She knew how to survive and how to win. And in the whisper-soaked marble halls of power, she became something more than an empress. She became a myth. Rome had seen power-hungry women before, sure, but no one played the game quite like she did. Once seated beside Claudius, Messalina didn't just sit there looking regal. She worked the court like a chessboard. Marriages, she arranged them. Enemies, she eliminated them. Allies, hand-picked often from her private, network. All while keeping up the sweet facade of a loyal wife, one hand on her husband's shoulder, the other firmly steering the empire. And then there's her reputation. Let's just say Messalina's name wasn't whispered only in the Senate halls. Ancient sources, mostly men, mostly bitter, spilled gallons of ink describing her legendary libido. According to them, she didn't just enjoy a bit of fun, she allegedly moonlighted in Rome's brothels, competing with professionals in late-night escapades before sneaking back to the palace for breakfast with the emperor. Now, whether this was fact or some top-tier historical slander is up for debate. But behind every juicy rumor was often a calculated move. Messalina wasn't just collecting lovers, she was collecting leverage. Powerful men, senators, rich heirs, sleeping with her wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was your ticket to a promotion. Other times, crossing her might get you a one-way trip to exile or the underworld. And Claudius? Either he had no idea or he really didn't want to know. With his empire to manage, his advisors squabbling, and his own self-doubt whispering in his ear, he may have preferred the blissful bubble of denial. Messalina, ever the actress, played the role of concerned wife to perfection, just innocent enough to keep the emperor calm, just clever enough to keep him clueless. But Rome always knew. Power in Rome had a real talent for tripping into the most unexpected laps, usually with all the grace of a toga-wearing toddler. When Emperor Caligula got the boot, and by boot we mean stabbed repeatedly, the imperial crown landed squarely on the very surprised head of Claudius. And just like that, his young wife, barely out of her 20s, was Empress of Rome. Now, most women might have needed a moment to get used to such a sudden glow-up. Not Messalina. She adjusted to power like she was born wearing a laurel wreath. Rome expected its empresses to be paragons of modesty and virtue, graceful statues in the background. Messalina took one look at that mold and promptly smashed it. Beneath the charming smile and youthful allure was a mind sharper than a gladius. She didn't just want to be the wife of the emperor, she wanted to run the empire, and she came equipped with a toolkit of charm, seduction, strategic marriages, and a healthy dose of fear. If Roman politics was a blood sport, Messalina came to play, and she wasn't pulling any punches. She was fluent in the language of secrets, which, in the Roman imperial court, was basically the official dialect. In a palace where whispers moved faster than couriers, Messalina became both a legend and a cautionary tale. Rome had seen ambitious women before, but never one who made ambition look like a lifestyle brand. Once crowned, she quickly became one of the most powerful women in the empire, not because of the title, but because she knew how to use it. Claudius might have worn the crown, but Messalina had the real power, whispering strategies in his ear, matchmaking the empire's elite like an ancient Tinder overlord, and casually removing anyone who looked at her funny. But her fame didn't stop at politics. Oh no, Messalina's real reputation came from what might best be described as her after-hours diplomacy. Ancient writers, mostly grumpy old men with serious vendettas, painted her as a kind of Roman femme fatale on turbo mode. Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, basically the TMZ of ancient history, all claimed she snuck out at night to moonlight in brothels, competing with the professionals just for the thrill. True, exaggerated, completely made up over too much wine. Hard to say. But even if the stories were embroidered, they reveal one thing. No other empress had a rep quite like hers. Behind every juicy rumor was a plan. Messalina didn't just pick lovers for fun. Many were high-ranking men, senators, military leaders, heirs with bank accounts and ambition. Sleeping with Messalina might come with a promotion. Crossing her could come with a one-way trip to exile, if you were lucky. Meanwhile, Claudius, dear, distracted Claudius, was either oblivious or pretending to be. Between his endless paperwork, court intrigue, and deep-rooted self-doubt, he seemed content with the illusion that he was in charge. Some say Messalina played the role of doting wife so well, he never saw the knife coming. Others think he just didn't want to see it. Facing the truth meant admitting his empire and his bedroom were both under someone else's control. But Rome knew. Oh, Rome always knew. Ah, Messalina, Rome's most infamous headline maker, centuries before tabloids were a thing. Her name echoed in the steam of bathhouses, snuck into gossip over wine, and danced from the lips of nervous senators and eye-rolling noblewomen. To some, she was the empress of indulgence, a walking scandal draped in silk. To others, she was simply terrifying because, while her appetite for drama was legendary, her grip on power was unshakably real. Imagine someone turning their bedroom into a political command center and their charm into a weapon of mass destruction. That was Messalina. She blurred the line between statecraft and seduction so thoroughly you'd be forgiven for confusing a Senate hearing with a date night. Rome's elite didn't know whether to fear her, flirt with her, or both, which more often than not ended badly either way. But here's the thing about unchecked power. It's like juggling fire while standing on a rickety ladder. The higher Messalina climbed, the more cracks spread beneath her perfectly pedicured feet. Despite her headline-grabbing escapades, Messalina wasn't just a one-woman reality show. She was a tactical genius in the bloodsport of Roman politics. Sure, her lovers were many, but her real targets were those who got in the way, rivals, critics, or anyone who didn't enthusiastically support her reign as queen of everything. And mercy? Not her thing. One of her favorite moves was the "oops, did I just ruin your life with a whisper" tactic. While the emperor, our dear, blissfully unaware Claudius, was distracted playing government, Messalina would quietly accuse people of treason, adultery, or whatever sounded spicy that day. Senators were sent packing to the underworld, noble women vanished, and entire families were wiped off the guest list of existence. Of course, every villain needs a good crew. Messalina had her entourage of shady freedmen, tattling informants, and suck-up officials who owed her everything. These goons helped her pull off purges, frame enemies, and keep the chaos machine running smoothly. Claudius, meanwhile, signed off on the whole thing with the enthusiasm of someone approving lunch orders, never realizing he was erasing his own loyal supporters, one signature at a time. But her greatest political masterpiece? That was personal. Claudius, bless his imperial heart, was in his 50s when he married Messalina, who was still in her 20s and full of the kind of charm that could melt marble. She wrapped him around her little finger with a mix of sweet smiles and strategic flattery. In public, he adored her. In private, she was quietly turning his trust into her personal dagger. And then came the power-up. A baby boy, not just any baby, Britannicus, son of Claudius, heir to the empire. With that move, Messalina wasn't just empress, she was mom to the future emperor. That title gave her serious immunity. After all, who would dare criticize the mother of Rome's next ruler? Spoiler, almost no one. But behind the gowns and gold, the walls were closing in. The list of enemies she'd made was growing faster than her wine bill. Even her own allies, fat from imperial favors, started whispering about her reckless ways. The web she wove was strong, but it was tightening. And in Rome, when power slips, it doesn't fall gently, it crashes hard. He was seen as the perfect husband if your dream man is bookish, gullible, and easily steamrolled by a cunning, power-hungry wife. Enter Messalina, master manipulator, empress of chaos, and soon-to-be headline scandal of the century. But even for the ever-tolerant Claudius, her latest stunt, allegedly marrying another man while still being, married to the emperor, was a bit much. When Narcissus, no, not the flower, the trusted aide, broke the news to Claudius, the emperor's reaction was pure sitcom disbelief. His darling wife, the mother of his son, secretly hitched to someone else like it was Vegas on a Saturday night? Ridiculous. But Narcissus wasn't just gossiping over wine. He brought receipts, witnesses, paperwork, a full-on ceremony. The emperor went from stunned to seething in record time. This wasn't tabloid fodder anymore, it was treason. And suddenly Claudius, often dismissed as too slow to lead, flipped the script. With the icy resolve of a man who's had enough, he handed emergency powers to Narcissus and ordered him to, take out the imperial trash. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers/enforcers, didn't rally to protect Messalina. they suited up to take her down, while Claudius returned to the palace, white as a toga and tight-lipped. Narcissus got to work. First, on the chopping block. Lucilius, Messalina's brand new husband and poster boy for bad life choices, he was yanked from his wedding after-party and executed on the spot. No trial, no last toast. Then came the others, her co-conspirators, her enablers, and anyone who'd been within whispering distance of the plot. A ruthless round of imperial spring cleaning. And Messalina? She didn't run, didn't even pack an overnight bag. In an oddly tragic twist, she actually believed she could charm her way out of it. Again. She scurried off to the gardens of Lucullus, hoping for one last heart-to-heart with Claudius, convinced he'd melt at the memory of her beauty, her flattery, and maybe the fact she gave him a son. But Claudius had officially stopped being a doormat. The strings were cut. The puppet show was over. At first, he couldn't bring himself to order her execution, some old ember of affection perhaps. But Narcissus, ever the efficient fixer, didn't wait. He dispatched a centurion with a short blade and a blunt message: either die with dignity or be paraded through Rome in disgrace. Messalina froze, the empress of seduction and schemes paralyzed by fear. She took the dagger and stalled. In the end, the centurion had to finish the job for her. And so, the most infamous woman in Roman imperial history died not in glory, but in a quiet garden, panicked, alone, and utterly powerless. With her gone, the palace fell silent, not relieved, not at peace, just cold, just tense. Because this wasn't just the end of a scandal, it was the end of an era. Seen as a bit of a softy, bookish, awkward, and about as assertive as a decorative fern, he seemed like the ideal husband for a power-hungry empress like Messalina. She had ambition, charm, and a dangerous talent for scheming, but even the most patient emperor has his limits, and hers came when she allegedly married another man in broad daylight while still very much married to the emperor. When the imperial insider Narcissus brought this bombshell to Claudius, the emperor's first reaction was, "You've got to be kidding me. His beloved wife, the mother of his son, starring in her own unauthorized wedding?" It sounded like a wild rumor until Narcissus started producing receipts, documents, witnesses, and full-on wedding ceremony debriefs. Claudius went from shocked to seething. This wasn't palace gossip anymore. This was high-octane treason. For a man mocked as slow and dim, Claudius suddenly flipped the switch. He gave Narcissus emergency powers and said, in essence, fix it. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite muscle, was called in, not to defend Messalina, but to take her out. While Claudius sat back in the palace, pale as parchment, Narcissus launched into action. Lucilius, Messalina's alleged new hubby, was yanked mid-celebration and executed right there in the street. No trial, no last toast. His co-conspirators and anyone who'd known a little too much was swiftly rounded up in a brutal political spring cleaning. And Messalina, she didn't bolt, didn't even try to go underground. In a bizarre twist of tragic overconfidence, she actually thought Claudius would forgive her. That her beauty, charm, and mother of the heir status would pull her through yet again. She ran to the gardens of Lucullus, hoping for a dramatic face-to-face to plead her case. But Claudius wasn't taking calls anymore. The puppet had cut his strings. Even then, Claudius wavered. He didn't immediately call for her death, but Narcissus wasn't about to let the emperor have second thoughts. He dispatched a centurion with a dagger and a choice: die with dignity or be dragged through Rome as a public spectacle. Faced with this grim offer, Messalina froze. She took the dagger but couldn't use it. In the end, the centurion finished the job. The empress who once ruled Rome with a wink and a whisper died alone, trembling in a garden. And just like that, the most infamous woman in Rome's imperial history was no more. Her death didn't just end a scandal, it sucked the oxygen out of the entire court. A cold silence fell, as if Rome itself paused to ask, what just happened? It was the ultimate historical delete button. Claudius, ever the stoic public figure, gave the order, erase her. Her name gone from every official scroll. Statues yanked down like bad art. Inscriptions chiseled into oblivion. Any document daring to mention her glorious chaos, either torched or sneakily edited. Rome was told to forget its empress. Problem is, how exactly do you forget that woman? The city, ever the drama queen, only got louder once she was gone. Gossip blazed through the streets like a chariot on fire. Some claimed she begged Claudius to save her with her last breath. Others swore she spat curses at him to the bitter end. Either way, one thing was clear. Her memory stuck around longer than her statues did. But the cleanup was just getting started. Silius and his crew were the appetizer. Claudius, now suspicious of everything that moved and even things that didn't, went full purge mode. Freedmen, officials, even that guy who once sat next to her at a dinner party, gone. Dismissed, jailed, or given the classic Roman retirement plan, execution. The Senate, desperate to stay on the emperor's good side, quickly joined the chorus of "Down with the scandalous empress." They passed decree after decree declaring her a disgrace to the empire, which according to them was now sparkling clean again. Sure it was. Only one person was spared, young Britannicus, Messalina's son and official heir to the throne. Claudius, in a rare show of dadness, couldn't bring himself to punish the boy for Mommy's epic mess. But with Messalina out of the picture, the imperial throne had a vacancy, and every ambitious noblewoman in Rome saw an opportunity in heels. Behind velvet curtains and heavily guarded villas, the political matchmaking began. Claudius, emotionally wrecked and politically drifting like a lost sandal in the Tiber, was more vulnerable than ever. This wasn't a period of healing. It was Rome's version of let's reboot and hope it doesn't crash. His trust in, well, anyone was in ruins. The only people he still relied on were his freedmen, an emperor without an empress, a dad with a dangerously underage heir, and a palace crawling with backstabbing career climbers. The empire was wobbling like a three-legged table, and what it needed, desperately, was a steady hand at the helm of the imperial household. Someone who could run the place without burning it down. But Claudius? Poor guy was still licking his wounds from the flaming betrayal of his last wife. Remarry? Yeah, no thanks. Then she showed up. Agrena the Younger, and let's be clear, she wasn't just cut from the same cloth as her predecessor. She brought her own scissors. Smart, stunning, and about as warm as a marble statue, Agrena had all the qualities of Messalina, except the recklessness. Where Messalina was chaos in a crown, Agrena was a spreadsheet in a toga. Born into the Julio-Claudian power club, she had a resume to kill for. Daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, and mother to a kid named Lucius Demetus Ahenabus. You might know him later as Nero. In other words, she didn't just come from the royal bloodline, she was practically its PR department. Agrena saw her opening. Unlike Messalina, who flirted her way through politics like it was a toga party, Agrena played chess while everyone else was still trying to learn checkers. She sat Claudius down, gave him the dignity of Rome pitch, and promised loyalty, stability, and a nice, tidy family brand. Also, no coups, probably. Claudius, older, wearier, and surrounded by advisors who could barely spell neutral, gave in. The marriage was controversial, something about them being a little too closely related, but the Senate gave it a legal thumbs up, and boom, Agrena was crowned empress. But let's not kid ourselves, this wasn't a romance. Agrena wasn't interested in being Mrs. Claudius. She wanted the empire itself. First order of business, torch the legacy of Messalina, figuratively and maybe a little literally. Her allies, gone. Her son Britannicus and his claim to the throne, quietly shelved. Her memory, rewritten like a bad scroll draft. Agrena replaced Claudius's team with her own loyal squad, set up a no-access VIP zone around the emperor, and started coaching little Nero like he was training for the Imperial Olympics. Slowly but surely, she wiped away any trace of the last regime, not with drama, but with cold efficiency. The Roman public, they were watching, confused and a little freaked out. Some whispered Agrena was just Messalina 2.0, with better hair and smarter strategy. Others thought she was something scarier entirely. Messalina had ruled with fire and fury. Agrena ruled with a calculator and a dagger in her sleeve. While Messalina had gone too far too fast, Agrena never moved until she was sure of the checkmate. Rome hadn't swapped one empress for another. It had swapped a wildfire for a slow-burning fuse. And if anyone thought Claudius could outmaneuver this new match, well, he barely survived the last one. The ghost of Messalina didn't disappear. It just slipped into a new body, wearing ambition like armor. And Agrena? She wasn't here to share power. She came to take it. After Messalina's untimely exit from the land of the living, spoiler, execution, by imperial drama, her son Britannicus found himself in a very awkward position, specifically in the center of a royal oops, wrong heir situation. Despite being the legitimate genetically certified offspring of Emperor Claudius, and thus next in line for the shiny purple toga, his future quickly unraveled like a poorly tied sandal strap. He was still a child when his mother was axed, figuratively and then literally, and the palace that once echoed with baby giggles and well-wishes for little Britannicus became more of a high-end hostage situation. At first, Claudius kept his boy nearby, surrounding him with tutors and guards, possibly hoping his family line wouldn't end in an embarrassing footnote. Ah, optimism. Enter Agrena the Younger, a woman with the ambition of a dozen politicians packed into one determined Roman matron. She took one look at Britannicus and thought, nope, too messy, too much like his mum, not happening. Instead, she set her sights on her own son, Nero, older, more malleable, and most importantly, hers. Agrena got to work with the subtlety of a chisel to marble. She painted Britannicus as immature, naive, and about as fit to rule as a particularly lazy house cat. Meanwhile, she was busy branding Nero like a prize bull, adopted by Claudius, renamed Nero Claudius Caesar, Ducis Germanicus, try fitting that on a coin, and stacked with titles like a buffet plate at a Roman feast. By the time Britannicus hit puberty, he wasn't the imperial golden boy, he was just a well-dressed liability. Guards watched his every move, his pals were exiled, his mentors replaced by loyalists to Agrena. Political babysitting at its finest. Claudius, now older and possibly sleepwalking through his final years, began drifting away from his biological son, choosing instead to dote on Nero like a favorite stepson in a very twisted soap opera. It was a sad fate for the young prince, heir by birth, prisoner by politics, and he knew it. Ancient gossip, or historians as they're called, claim Britannicus grew wary, bitter, and always kept one eye open, probably remembering how quickly things went south for his mom. Then Claudius died under mysterious circumstances, mysterious here meaning probably poisoned, and the top suspect, you guessed it, a Grainer. Nero ascended the throne without so much as a raised eyebrow. Now officially an emperor, Nero saw Britannicus not as a stepbrother but as a threat with a heartbeat. And threats must be eliminated, preferably over hors d'oeuvres. During a banquet just 1 year later, Britannicus suddenly keeled over. The official report said epilepsy. Ancient sources wink and say poison. Either way, the royal drama came to a very final end at the dinner table. And just like that, Messilina's bloodline was snuffed out. Not with swords or uprisings, but with whatever was in that cup. Her legacy, though, that was another matter entirely. Messilina herself may have died in disgrace, but her reputation refused to lie still. The more the empire tried to bury her memory, the more she became a legend. Rome's go-to symbol of scandalous womanhood, seductive, power-hungry, and completely unforgettable. But was it fair? Probably not. Most of what we know about her comes from cranky Roman dudes, Tacitus, Suetonius, Juvenal, who weren't exactly fans of ambitious women with agency. To them, she wasn't a savvy political player. She was just the empress-shaped problem they never wanted to solve. She was the Roman Empire's favorite cautionary tale, a femme fatale in a toga, a woman so allegedly scandalous that history practically clutched its pearls just writing about her. She supposedly turned her sexuality into a weapon, corrupted imperial morals, and squeezed every ounce of drama out of her life like it was a soap opera set in marble halls. They whispered about her sneaking off to brothels at midnight, marrying someone else in full public view, and collecting lovers like trophies. But let's be real, these accounts have the whiff of a moral panic rather than reliable biography. Nowadays, some historians are beginning to raise an eyebrow at the whole narrative. Was Messilina really the scandalous siren of Rome, or just the unfortunate victim of a bad press campaign? It wouldn't be the first time a powerful Roman woman was rewritten as a she-demon the second she stopped being useful. Think of the way history treated Cleopatra, or a Grainer. In a society where all the power wielders wore sandals and sexism, a woman couldn't be ambitious without getting slapped with a label. Either she was a saint or a seductress. Guess which one Messilina got to be. And yet, underneath all the spicy gossip and over-the-top allegations, there's one thing that rings true. She was powerful. Really powerful. Messilina was no idle courtesan lounging on a chaise longue, waiting for drama to happen. She made the drama. She navigated the Roman political snake pit with flair, knocked out her enemies like chess pieces, ensured her son's path to the throne, and did it all in a world where men thought political power was a boys-only game. Sure, maybe she used charm, maybe she inspired fear, maybe both, but she got things done. Her fall wasn't just personal, it shifted the tectonic plates of Roman succession. It cleared the stage for a Grainer's rise and gave Nero his golden ticket to the imperial seat. Her ambition echoed through history, through plays, paintings, and every portrayal of a scandalous empress that followed. Messilina became a trope, the seductive villainess, the empress gone wild, the original scandal in a stola. But beneath that legend might have been a woman who dared to play a rigged game and got punished not for playing it badly, but for playing it well. Her biggest offense? Being too powerful, too cunning, and too female for comfort. And in the end, it wasn't the affairs that rocked the empire. It was the uncomfortable truth that a woman could rule not just hearts, but empires. Meanwhile, across the ocean and about 1,800 years later, a powdered-wigged genius was busy stirring up his own drama in the early days of the United States. Picture it. Alexander Hamilton, sharp mind, founding father, financial wizard, and apparently the protagonist of America's first political sex scandal. It's 1791. Hamilton is at the peak of his career, juggling national debt like a champ as the first Secretary of the Treasury. By day, he's shaping the financial future of a fledgling country. By night? Well, let's just say it was less spreadsheets, more scandal sheets. Enter Maria Reynolds, a distressed young woman who shows up at his Philadelphia doorstep, claiming her husband has abandoned her and asking for help. Hamilton, gallant as ever, offers assistance, which quickly escalates into a year-long affair. And then, plot twist, her husband, James Reynolds, finds out, and instead of dueling Hamilton like a gentleman, he opts for a much more profitable move, blackmail. For over a year, Hamilton paid hush money to keep the affair under wraps. It didn't stay that way. When it all came to light, the affair exploded into the public eye, dragging Hamilton's reputation through the early American mud and making headlines faster than you can say, founding father fiasco. So there you have it. 2 eras, 2 epic scandals, and 2 cautionary tales. One from the marble halls of Rome, the other from the cobblestone streets of early America. Both remind us that when it comes to power, politics, and desire, history isn't just written by the victors, it's edited by their enemies. Secrets in politics are like bad plumbing. Ignore them long enough, and eventually the whole thing explodes. And explode it did in 1797, when whispers of scandal started floating through the halls of power like smoke before a fire. The culprit? None other than everyone's favorite number-crunching founding father, who suddenly found himself starring in a tabloid-worthy drama. His political enemies, especially those with a taste for democracy and a deep dislike for strong central banks, got wind of something juicy. Not only had this powdered wig policy wonk been caught in a steamy affair with a woman named Maria, but rumours also suggested he'd sweeten the deal with government money. Cue the national gasp. Was he using taxpayer dollars to pay hush money to Maria and her opportunistic husband? That kind of scandal could sink a career faster than a cannonball in a rowboat. So what did he do? Cry? Hide? Deny? Oh no, he pulled a full dramatic monologue. He wrote a 95-page confession. 95! That's not a statement, that's a novella. Known as the infamous Reynolds pamphlet, it laid out every sultry, awkward, morally questionable detail of the affair. No denials, no euphemisms, just page after page of yes, I did it, yes, I paid her husband. No, I didn't embezzle from Uncle Sam. The fallout was, well, spectacular. His fellow Federalists were stunned. His enemies were practically cartwheeling through the Capitol. His reputation nosedived, his influence with the bigwigs in Washington cratered, and yet he held firm. If he had to choose between being known as a cheat in bed or a cheat with money, he picked the bedroom scandal. Integrity somewhat intact. Dignity scattered to the wind. Turns out America's most combative founding father wasn't brought low by a duel or a political showdown, but by lust, blackmail, and a pamphlet that probably made even the most seasoned printer blush. And speaking of complicated legacies, Thomas Jefferson, often hailed as the high-minded architect of liberty, equality, and those three inalienable rights we love to quote, had a secret that didn't match his public ideals. Behind the stately columns of his beloved hilltop estate was a truth he never acknowledged, a hidden family born in bondage. Sally Hemings was an enslaved woman at his estate. She was also, awkwardly, his late wife's half-sister, thanks to the complicated and disturbing realities of slavery. That dark irony hasn't been lost on historians. Hemings was just about 14 years old when Jefferson, then in his 40s, is believed to have begun a relationship with her during a stay in Paris. Très scandalous. For years, this story was dismissed as little more than gossip, the stuff of whispered accusations. But Hemings's descendants kept their history alive through stories of secrecy, closeness, and children. In the 1990s, modern science settled the matter. DNA tests showed Jefferson was the father of at least 6 of Hemings's children. 4 of them made it to adulthood. Did he ever free Sally? Nope. But he did quietly grant freedom to all of her surviving children, making them the only enslaved individuals he ever freed in his lifetime. Some of them even escaped, in ways so conveniently overlooked, it's hard not to raise an eyebrow. So there you have it. Behind the statues and slogans, the founders had their own brand of mess, affairs, pamphlets, secret children. It's like a colonial-era soap opera with powdered wigs and quill pens. Some folks were granted their freedom, officially, in his will. And wouldn't you know it, each one walked into freedom looking suspiciously like dear old Dad. The resemblance was uncanny. Despite a mountain of evidence, Jefferson's cheerleaders clung to the image of him as a beacon of moral righteousness. But then came the not-so-little detail of a hidden family, which blew that halo clean off. Here was the guy who penned "All men are created equal," while simultaneously running a plantation that denied humanity to others, and personally profiting from it. Talk about a plot twist. Just to twist the knife a little more, Jefferson kept detailed plantation logs, and guess what? Every time he popped by Monticello, Sally Hemings just happened to become pregnant. It doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to connect the dots. But what's really missing? A confession. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged the relationship, never uttered the names of his other children, and never addressed the massive elephant tap dancing in the middle of his political principles. As for Sally Hemings, she left no writings, no letters, no diary, nothing in her own hand. What we know about her comes filtered through the words of men who saw her not as a person, but as property. And yet, her children? They went on to live as free Americans, carrying both Jefferson's name and his staggering hypocrisy. Behind all the lofty Enlightenment ideals was a second, secret family, tucked behind shutters, hidden in shadows, carrying both the legacy and the burden of one of America's founding contradictions. Now, while Jefferson was out here redefining the term double life, Benjamin Franklin was busy being America's first rock star, printer, inventor, diplomat, philosopher, basically a one-man Renaissance fair. But old Ben had a wild side that would have sent colonial grandmas straight to the fainting couch. Let's talk Hellfire Club. While historians still argue over just how deep Franklin got into this secret society, we know he spent years in England when it was at its scandalous peak. The Hellfire Club wasn't your average book club. think less Oprah, more eyes wide shut in powdered wigs. Their motto, do what thou wilt. Translation, party hard. Question everything. Wear a robe if you feel like it. It wasn't about satanic rituals. It was more champagne in hidden caves, wild debates, and occasional nudity among the elite. And when Franklin wasn't spelunking into debauchery, he was enjoying the French version of fun. As ambassador to France, he was a regular at Parisian salons where politics, philosophy, and flirtation mingled freely. French women adored him, and let's just say the feeling was mutual. Even in his golden years, Franklin had game. He famously wrote that older women made better lovers because, quote, they don't yell, they don't tell, and they're grateful as hell. That's not in the Constitution, but maybe it should have been. And let's not forget Franklin's love of secret identities. He moonlighted under names like Mrs. Silence Dogood, Polly Baker, and Richard Saunders, each one letting him critique religion, sex, and social hypocrisy with razor-sharp wit. He wasn't just trolling before it was cool, he was laying the foundation for satirical commentary in America. Though he was married to Deborah Reed, Franklin spent a good chunk of time gallivanting across Europe, writing, charming, philosophizing, and occasionally, networking in a way that would make Tinder blush. So behind the bifocals and political theories, Franklin was a man of shadows and satire, passion and paradox. Just like Jefferson, he reminds us that the founding fathers weren't marble statues. They were messy, brilliant, deeply flawed humans, and sometimes very entertaining ones at that. He was brilliant, combative, and, let's be honest, a bit of a handful. But behind that grumpy New England shell beat the heart of a man who spilled his deepest truths not through speeches, but through ink. And no one received more of those soul-bearing dispatches than his wife, Abigail. Their letters? Think less stiff founding father and more 18th century power couple with a serious long-distance texting habit. While some of his fellow revolutionaries were off gallivanting, vanishing for years, or pretending their personal lives didn't exist, these two were writing like there was no tomorrow. Over 1,100 letters survive, basically a colonial version of a never-ending email chain. In them, John unloaded everything: political headaches, existential dread, gossip about the other guys in wigs, and yes, even a whole lot of love. When John was stuck in Philadelphia or traipsing around Europe, Abigail wasn't just holding down the fort, she was his most trusted advisor. Forget behind every great man, Abigail was right there, offering takes on inflation, war diplomacy, and which revolutionaries were being extra shady. She even gave him a legendary nudge. "Remember the ladies," she urged, dropping an early mic in the fight for women's rights, long before it was fashionable. But our man John also had issues. The poor guy lived with a full-time case of historical FOMO. He was convinced the world would forget him while swooning over Washington's statuesque silence or Franklin's charming old man energy. And when Jefferson started getting all the post-presidency love, oh, he was steaming. His retirement letters are a buffet of envy, petty jabs, and thirst for acknowledgement. Now, make no mistake, Adams was difficult. He had opinions and they were sharp enough to draw blood. He brawled with Hamilton, side-eyed Jefferson, and cycled through political parties like someone trying on wigs at a costume shop. His presidency was rocky with scandals like the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, spoiler alert, were not exactly great for free speech. Yet, amidst all the drama, Adams had something no law could touch: an unshakable moral compass. He was the only founding father who flat out refused to own slaves, not because it was easy, but because it was right. It cost him politically and financially, but he didn't budge. No parades, no statues, just quiet, stubborn integrity. He wasn't smooth, he wasn't worshipped, but he was blisteringly honest in his policies, his writing, and especially in those midnight letters to Abigail. His legacy isn't the most glamorous, but it's possibly the most human. And then there was Madison, the Constitution's soft-spoken mastermind. He looked more like a pocket-sized philosopher than a revolutionary heavyweight, but beneath the polite whispers was a man wrestling with a chaotic world and a malfunctioning body. Barely over 5 feet tall and weighing less than a well-fed turkey, Madison was about as physically imposing as a library chair. He was plagued by mystery illnesses, likely epilepsy, that knocked him out of commission for stretches of time. No press releases, no dramatic exits, just sudden vanishing acts while he recuperated in private. Friends often described him as ghostly pale, like a colonial Casper with a law degree. But don't be fooled by the frail frame or the gentle voice. Madison was quietly, relentlessly shaping the foundation of a nation, even as his own foundation was constantly threatening to collapse beneath him. He was brilliant, combative, and, let's be honest, occasionally about as pleasant as a porcupine in a balloon shop. But beneath that gruff New England shell was a man who kept his deepest thoughts not on his tongue, but on paper. And no one got more of that paper than his wife, Abigail. Their letter exchange wasn't just couple goals, it was an 18th century power couple group chat, with over 1,100 messages that give us a front row seat to early American politics and a surprisingly progressive marriage. While other founding fathers were off having scandals, vanishing for years, or pretending emotions were just for peasants, John and Abigail wrote constantly. Love notes, political strategy, existential dread, you name it. John spilled it all. When he was off doing democracy in Philadelphia or hobnobbing with powdered wigs in Europe, Abigail wasn't just holding down the fort. She was his most trusted advisor, regularly weighing in on trade policy, diplomatic fiascos, and whether the revolutionaries were being complete dingbats. Spoiler, they often were. And Abigail? She didn't just bring the receipts, she brought the revolution. Remember the ladies, she wrote, basically telling him, hey, maybe don't forget that women are people too, bold, brilliant, and centuries ahead of her time. But John? Oh, John had feelings. The man was basically a one-man anxiety spiral in a tricorn hat. He obsessed over his legacy, stewed over how Washington and Franklin hogged the limelight, and panicked that history would ghost him. And honestly, he wasn't totally wrong. After his presidency, he watched Jefferson rise to celebrity status while he became the guy people forgot to invite to the after-party. Retirement didn't mellow him out either. His letters from that era are practically dripping with salt, grumpy, envious, and forever thirsting for validation. And it didn't help that he had the charm of a cactus. Adams was known for being difficult. He thought most politicians were idiots, and he wasn't shy about saying so, feuded with Hamilton, mistrusted Jefferson, and managed to alienate pretty much every political squad at least once. His presidency, let's just say the Alien and Sedition Acts were about as popular as attacks on hugs. Yet for all his messy bits, John had a moral backbone you could hang a cannon on. He was the only founding father who flat out refused to own slaves. No loopholes, no excuses, even when it tanked his popularity and his wallet. That kind of principled stubbornness didn't make front-page news, but it defined him. No, he wasn't smooth or universally loved, but he was fiercely, unflinchingly himself, honest to a fault, both on paper and in policy. And in those late-night letters to Abigail, we don't just meet a founding father, we meet a very human husband, a flawed patriot, and a man who poured everything he was into ink. Then there was James Madison, Mr. Constitution himself. At first glance, you might mistake him for someone's shy uncle who only speaks at Thanksgiving when spoken to. But this quiet revolutionary was fighting on two fronts: political chaos on the outside and a body that basically ran on 18th century duct tape and prayers. Standing just over 5 feet tall and weighing under 100 pounds, Madison wasn't exactly commanding in presence. More like, is that a statesman or a strong breeze in a waistcoat? He battled chronic health issues for most of his life, likely epilepsy, and worked hard to keep his struggles out of public view. Friends often commented on how ghostly he looked and how he'd sometimes vanish from the spotlight to recover from mysterious spells. Yet, despite the odds, he wrote the blueprint for American democracy. From behind his small frame and soft-spoken manner came some of the loudest ideas in the nation's history. Madison may not have looked like a revolutionary, but his brain was throwing political grenades the whole time. He lived under a constant cloud of doom, genuinely convinced that stress or overwork might drop him dead on the spot. The anxiety was so real that he didn't even bother writing a memoir. Why waste time chronicling your life when you're convinced you'll expire before the ink dries? But oh, how wrong he was. Despite the dramatic fatalism, he didn't just live, he mattered. Big time. He was the brilliant mind behind the US Constitution and a heavyweight co-author of the Federalist Papers. But you'd never hear that from him. While others elbowed their way to the front of the parade, he was the guy quietly building the floats, sewing the banners, and rewriting the route from backstage. Loudmouths like Hamilton and Jefferson grabbed the mic. He preferred the shadows. While they shouted and gestured on the political stage, he was in the back room, carefully laying the groundwork for an entire system of government, probably with an ink-stained sleeve and a deep sigh. Then there was his wife. Oh, Dolly. She was everything James wasn't. Dazzling, charismatic, the life of every room she entered. If James was the software, Dolly was the user interface. Their marriage wasn't just sweet, it was strategic. Dolly turned their home into the place to be in Washington. She threw salons where political enemies clinked teacups over her legendary cakes, and yes, really, ice cream, while James quietly reprogrammed democracy in the other room. Still, the man had baggage, deep, complicated, morally awkward baggage. Madison was a slaveholder, and while he personally squirmed at the idea of slavery, he did precisely zero to stop participating in it. He even exchanged hush-hush letters about how slavery might work in the shiny new republic. His thoughts were nuanced, his actions not so much. As the years ticked by, things got gloomier. Madison wrestled with depression and faded from the political spotlight. He watched in real time as his carefully limited government ballooned into something he barely recognized. No charm offensive like Franklin, no statuesque glory like Washington. But make no mistake, this man shaped the Republic's blueprints. He just didn't get the applause. He built the stage, others got the standing ovation. Now let's talk about the guy who lit the fuse, Thomas Paine. Paine was the working-class firebrand with a pen so sharp it could cut through British red tape from across the ocean. No powdered wigs or pedigree here, just a broke Englishman who landed in America at 37, armed with little more than a letter from Ben Franklin and a revolutionary attitude. Then came 1776, and common sense hit the colonies like a pamphlet-shaped lightning bolt. Over 100,000 copies flew off the shelves or, were passed around taverns, an insane number for the time. It wasn't stuffy political theory, it was fiery, plain-spoken rage. He didn't suggest independence, he demanded it. He dunked on monarchy, laughed in the face of tradition, and laid out a case for a government that actually worked for the people. But here's the plot twist. While the revolution got the fireworks, Paine got the cold shoulder. Unlike his fellow firestarters, he didn't ride off into political glory. Nope, he ended up a pariah. The very country he helped ignite eventually ghosted him, politically and personally. So, while some founding figures got portraits and parades, others like Madison and Paine were left with quiet legacies, complicated shadows, and the bitter irony of being essential, and yet almost forgotten. He flat out refused to sign the Constitution unless it gave the federal government a firm grip on slavery, a stance that eventually got softened, much to his annoyance. But when he got back home, no softening there. This guy wasn't interested in playing the role of respectable gentleman. He delayed marriage until later in life, preferring a long parade of mistresses and eyebrow-raising romances that made his fellow founding fathers shift uncomfortably in their powdered wigs. Then, at age 57, he really blew high society's collective monocle off by marrying his housekeeper, Anne Carey Randolph. Now, Anne wasn't just any housekeeper, she was smack in the middle of a juicy scandal involving an alleged abortion and whispers of infanticide. The gossip columns practically lit themselves on fire, but Morris didn't blink. Drama was his natural habitat. He was used to raising eyebrows and defying expectations. Even his death was, let's say, on brand. Legend has it he tried to self-treat a urinary blockage by sticking a whalebone up his urethra. Yes, you read that right. Unsurprisingly, this didn't end well. It caused internal injuries that proved fatal. True or not, the tale fits the man. Morris lived like a maverick and died like a myth. In a room packed with powdered hair, moral lectures and self-righteous declarations, Morris stood out as a one-legged, razor-witted wild card. Arguably one of the most fascinating characters you've probably never heard of. Now, while these gentlemen were busy birthing a nation with big dreams, liberty, justice, equality, their private lives often stomped all over the ideals they so passionately preached. And as the legend of American greatness grew, so did the habit of sweeping those pesky contradictions under the rug. Let's start with the elephant in the room: slavery. Many of the same men who declared that all men are created equal owned slaves, profited from their labor, or fiercely defended the institution. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, they weren't just founding fathers, they were also plantation bosses. As they debated freedom, enslaved people were outside their windows, working the land and living in chains, completely excluded from the liberty that was supposedly being drafted into law. Sure, a few, like Franklin and Hamilton, made some effort to push toward abolition, but none of them tore down the system that underpinned their society and bank accounts. Then there's the matter of women. Abigail Adams famously told her husband to remember the ladies. as he helped draft the laws of the land. Spoiler alert, he didn't. None of them did. The Constitution ignored women completely. In their letters, these men cooed about their wives and daughters, but legally, those same women had no rights, no vote, and definitely no say in the nation's grand experiment. And let's not forget the moral gymnastics, affairs, love children, secret clubs, shady whispers, you name it. It was probably happening behind closed doors. Yet they wrote about virtue, restraint, and honor, like they were in a contest for sainthood. They slammed tyranny overseas while keeping inequality alive and well at home. They feared kings but were totally fine with letting wealth and power pass down like family heirlooms. To be fair, some of them knew they were walking contradictions. Washington was haunted by slavery in his final years. Madison wrote long, worried essays about the dangers of political factions, while simultaneously building the party system he claimed to fear. So yes, the Founding Fathers built a new nation, but they also built it with blind spots, contradictions, and double standards. And somehow their myths often skipped those chapters entirely. He flat out refused to sign the Constitution unless it gave the federal government a firm grip on slavery. Yeah, not exactly the hill you want to die on. In the end, that demand got watered down like cheap colonial punch. But when he got back home, he didn't exactly start behaving himself. Marriage? Oofed. That was for later. First came a legendary run of mistresses and eyebrow-raising affairs that had his political pals sweating in their breeches. Then at 57, he really shook things up. He married his housekeeper, Anne Carey Randolph. She was already the headline act in a scandal circus involving a supposed abortion and accusations of infanticide. The gossip rags went wild. Did he care? Not even a little. Morris was perfectly comfortable being the outlier, the odd duck in a pond of powdered wigs. Even his death had flair. According to legend, brace yourself, he tried to fix a urinary blockage by shoving a whalebone into his, plumbing. Spoiler, it did not end well. The result was fatal internal damage. Is the story true? Who knows, but honestly, it's so in character it doesn't even sound that far-fetched. He lived and died with style, his own chaotic, unapologetic style. In a room full of self-righteous founding fathers, he was the one-legged, sharp-tongued wild card you never learned about in school, but absolutely should have. Now let's zoom out a bit. The founding fathers talked a big game about liberty, justice, and equality, but their home lives often looked like an 18th century episode of Scandal. While they birthed a nation with soaring ideals, they quietly buried their own contradictions under powdered wigs and patriotic prose. Slavery? Oh, the mother of all hypocrisies. These guys, many of them, proclaimed all men are created equal while owning other humans. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, card-carrying slaveholders. They were drafting declarations by candlelight while enslaved people worked their fields, stripped of every right those documents claimed to defend. Sure, a couple of them, like Franklin and Hamilton, dabbled in abolition talk, but let's not kid ourselves. No one took down the system that made their lifestyles possible. And women? Don't even get started. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband begging him to remember the ladies while he helped shape the new nation's laws. He promptly forgot. Actually, all of them did. The Constitution left women out entirely. In their letters, they waxed poetic about wives and daughters, but legally those women had no vote, no rights, and definitely no say. Then there's the moral compass, perpetually spinning. Affairs, secret kids, elite clubs, hushed-up scandals. They had it all. Meanwhile, they preached virtue, honor, and moral restraint like they were running the Sunday school. They decried tyranny overseas while baking inequality into their own political pie. They warned against monarchy, then turned around and let dynasties of wealth and privilege bloom in the new republic. To be fair, some of them did see the cracks. Washington spent his final years in tortured reflection over slavery. Madison penned long essays about the dangers of political factions while he was busy inventing the party system. The truth is, the Founding Fathers were brilliant, complicated, flawed men. They built a nation and built it on contradictions. Some people, like a certain wig-wearing statesman with a quill fetish, had an impressive knack for mental gymnastics. Take this guy, he'd spent his morning penning grand philosophical treatises about liberty and equality, then pivot to overseeing enslaved laborers by the afternoon, like he was switching tabs on a browser. Hypocrisy? Sure. But also human. These founding figures weren't divine beings wrapped in bedsheets. They were fiercely intelligent, power-hungry, and deeply flawed dudes, juggling lofty ideals with messy realities. They built a country on contradictions, glorious, frustrating, enduring contradictions, and those contradictions still echo today. Their legacy isn't carved solely in stone statues or dusty documents. It lives on as an endless national argument about freedom, about power, about morality, and about who gets the pen when it's time to write the story. Behind their powdered wigs and patriotic speeches were scandals, compromises, and more tangled drama than a reality show reunion. And in all that chaos lies not just the beginning of a nation, but the blueprint of its ongoing identity crisis. Meanwhile, over in Europe, there was a guy who could outmaneuver entire armies but couldn't handle a romantic cold shoulder. Picture it. Napoleon, yes, that Napoleon, conquering continents by day and losing sleep over unanswered texts, well, letters, by night. Behind the steely stare of a military mastermind was a man hopelessly, pathetically in love with one woman, Josephine. Their romance kicked off like a steamy period drama. Josephine, a sophisticated widow 6 years his senior, utterly bewitched the future emperor. He fell hard, fast, and dramatically. They married in 1796, and within minutes, okay, maybe weeks, Napoleon was off to war, leaving her in Paris with a pen, some paper, and clearly not enough urgency. From the front lines, he poured out his soul like a teenage poet. In one letter, he basically says, "I woke up drenched in thoughts of you and last night's activities." In another, he begs her not to bathe until he returns. Yes, really. The man commanded legions but couldn't handle a bar of soap coming between him and her scent. His letters yo-yoed between steamy, clingy, and downright paranoid. He'd crush enemies in battle, then sit down to whine that Josephine hadn't written back fast enough. Silence was betrayal. One day he was whispering sweet nothings, the next he was rage-writing accusations with his quill in a death grip. Josephine, on the other hand, was living her best life. While Napoleon was out inventing military strategy, she was sipping wine in Parisian salons and collecting admirers. Her replies were polite, vague, and about as emotionally invested as a weather report. Eventually, she took lovers of her own. Napoleon was gutted, and yet he still couldn't quit her. His letters turned desperate, even haunted. He wrote of sleepless nights and unending torment. It was a tragic love story, mostly for him. Josephine remained cool, distant, and infuriatingly indifferent. His romance was a one-man show scribbled in ink, soaked in obsession, and probably a little tear-stained. Years after he ditched his first wife in 1810 for a more politically strategic match with Marie Louise of Austria, Napoleon still couldn't shake his feelings for Josephine. The man might have ruled an empire, but his heart was a lost cause. Even while exiled to the middle of nowhere, he reportedly kept her portrait by his bedside. Talk about holding a grudge of love. And as he lay dying on the remote rock of St. Helena, his final words were allegedly a fever dream of devotion. France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. Basically, even on his way out, he still couldn't stop thinking about his ex. For all his battlefield brilliance, love remained the one campaign he could never quite win. His letters? Less military strategy, more open-heart surgery. They're not just history, they're the tear-stained ramblings of a man thoroughly wrecked by a woman who never quite matched his passion. And speaking of emotional train wrecks turned into art, Frida Kahlo didn't just paint pain, she published it in Technicolor with exclamation points. Her love letters to Diego Rivera, the mural painting behemoth who doubled as her soulmate and her emotional wrecking ball, are nothing short of poetic carnage. While most people try to mask heartbreak with vague Facebook quotes, Frida went full Shakespeare meets volcano. Her words are raw, bloody valentines that bleed straight from her soul onto the page. Their relationship was less romance and more romantic demolition derby. He was 2 decades older, massively talented, and about as faithful as a cat in a room full of laser pointers. She was a brilliant fireball of a woman with a busted spine and a heart that didn't come with brakes. Together, pure combustion, passion, betrayal, repeat. Her letters read like emotional confessions under a full moon. In one, she writes, "Nothing compares to your hands, nothing like the green gold of your eyes. My body is filled with you for days and days." In another, "I love you more than my own skin. Someone get this woman a glass of wine and a hug." She nicknamed him her frog toad, a strangely adorable insult that somehow manages to mix pure love with deep frustration. And just when you think she's done, nope. The same paragraph might whip from undying adoration to nuclear resentment. Diego cheated, frequently with friends, with her sister. But Frida didn't respond with cold silence. She responded with letters that dripped with desire and demanded connection. "I ask you for violence in the nonsense," she wrote, "and you give me grace, your light, and your warmth." Translation: she wanted chaos, and he gave her confusing comfort. They divorced in 1939, got remarried in 1940, and basically never settled into anything resembling stability. Still, their bond was like emotional duct tape, messy, unconventional, and impossible to rip apart. Even when separated, Frida wrote as if she was suffocating without him. He was her oxygen, infuriating, essential, and always somehow out of reach. And on top of the emotional roller coaster, her physical agony bled into her letters too. Every word a brushstroke of suffering, every sentence another portrait of pain. Frida didn't hide her hurt. She weaponized it. After a nightmarish bus crash that left her in constant pain for the rest of her life, she described her body not as a temple, but as a battlefield. And while Diego couldn't win the war, he somehow made the trenches feel like home. Her vulnerability? Total. But weakness? Never. Her letters, though often stamped with Diego's name, weren't just about him. They were dispatches from the front lines of love and identity, fierce devotion and sheer survival. She didn't just endure pain, she turned it into poetry. Longing became her kindling, and in that fire she didn't just burn, she blazed her way into history. Now, over in the concert hall of tortured hearts, cue the stormy genius of classical music, a man with wild hair, worse moods, and a knack for composing symphonies that sound like emotions being punched in the face, Beethoven. Among his belongings, found after his death in 1827, was a bundle of unsent love letters. No dates, no names, just a whirlwind of raw emotion scribbled to someone we know only as the immortal beloved. Who was she? A woman? A muse? A figment of late-night existential panic? The world may never know. The letters? Absolute drama. One starts with, "My angel, my all, my very self." Another basically cries into its own paper. "Though still in bed, my thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved. What tearful longing for you. You, my life, my all, farewell. Oh, continue to love me, never misjudge the most faithful heart of your beloved." Now, Beethoven wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. To most people, his writing style ranged from dry toast to do not engage. But in these letters, he's all heart, no armor, vulnerable, intimate, sometimes barely holding it together. And there's a twist, he wasn't writing this from a cozy, candlelit room next to her. He was writing from a place of distance, maybe even despair. The words drip with separation, secrecy, and a sense of, we can't be together, but oh, how I wish we could. Star-crossed doesn't even begin to cover it. So who was she? The guesses range from a married aristocrat to a widowed countess to a former piano student, all strong contenders, all romantically entangled with him at some point. And yet, no answer has ever quite stuck. The mystery lingers, the music plays on, and the immortal beloved, still immortal, still beloved, still unknown. What's absolutely certain is that Beethoven was head over heels in love. Whether it happened once or a dozen times is anyone's guess, but one thing's clear. This immortal beloved of his was in a league of her own. She was his muse, his misery, his impossible dream wrapped in heartbreak and a major chord. And then, cue dramatic silence. The letters, never sent. Maybe he chickened out. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe she was already sipping tea in another realm. Here's the man who shook the heavens with his symphonies, yet it's these unsent scribbles, full of yearning, frustration, and grief, that whisper his soul's quietest notes. We may never know who she was, but every tragic tremble of his music still murmurs her name. Fast forward to the Victorian era, where our next heartbroken hero was not a composer, but a professional wit, armed with sarcasm, silk waistcoats, and more emotional turmoil than a soap opera marathon. He also wrote a love letter, except this one wasn't a swoony sonnet. Oh no, this was a 50,000-word emotional monsoon called De Profundis, Latin for from the depths, which is exactly where it came from, the bottom of his soul and a prison cell. He wrote it while doing time for the unspeakable crime of loving the wrong person. His relationship with a charming young aristocrat, let's just call him Lord Brooding Drama, had turned society into a scandalized mess and got our letter writer thrown behind bars. Champagne parties? Gone. Literary fame? Tarnished. Dignity? Hanging by a thread. The letter starts off sad, but buckle up because it spirals into a symphony of confessions, accusations, and poetic gut punches. "You came to me to learn the pleasure of life and art," he writes. "Maybe I was meant to teach you something deeper, the beauty of sorrow." Whoa, that's not just heartbreak, that's heartbreak in italics. He doesn't hold back. vanity, selfishness, betrayal, all hurled with the grace of a man who's read a lot of Shakespeare and isn't afraid to use it. But through it all, he never stops loving the guy. That's the twist. One sentence seethes with blame, the next begs for affection. It's not just a breakup letter, it's the funeral procession for a life once full of laughter and brilliance. He doesn't spare himself either. Oh no, he lays out his own flaws like tarot cards, his excess, his denial, his desperate hope that he could transform his lover into someone noble, someone worthy. Spoiler, he couldn't. Instead, he was devoured. And yet De Profundis isn't just a literary sobfest, it's a philosophical revelation. Our imprisoned author compares Christ to the ultimate artist of sorrow. He reflects on how pain breeds compassion, how prison stripped him bare and made him real. In the end, it's not just about a failed romance, it's about the raw, weird, tragic beauty of being human. He once wrote, "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." And boy, was he standing knee-deep in holiness. After getting out, he sent that painfully poetic letter to his old flame, but the bridge had long since gone up in flames. The damage was done. The love, toasted. A few years later, he died, broke, and banished, a sad full stop to an already messy paragraph. That letter, De Profundis, didn't see the light of day in full until both of them had exited stage, left. Now, this wasn't your classic, heart-eyed, emoji kind of love letter. No roses, no candlelight dinners. This was a literary autopsy of the soul, raw, unfiltered, and more about what love takes when it's all out of things to give. You don't read it, you wince your way through it. And speaking of literary icons tangled up in emotion, let's talk about one composed genius with a storm bubbling beneath the surface, a sharp-witted modernist who looked like she had it all under control. Married to Leonard, a rock-solid man who clearly deserved a medal for patience, she found herself head over very sensible shoes, in love with someone else entirely, a fellow writer, an aristocrat, a tornado in silk scarves. Their affair? Oh, forget categories. Emotional? Absolutely. Intellectual, like dueling brains in corsets. Romantic? A Hallmark card would have combusted. And yes, at times, physical, though tastefully Victorian about it. They met in the 1920s, and what bloomed between them wasn't just romance. It was a correspondence so poetic, it could make the Oxford English Dictionary weep. In one of those early letters, she wrote, "I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia. It is incredible how essential to me you have become." And just like that, the usually poised wordsmith became the one writing like she'd lost her Wi-Fi and her will to live. Her love letters were a cocktail of wit, yearning, and just a splash of emotional unraveling. She saw in her lover not just a romantic partner, but a living embodiment of boldness and freedom, the kind of femininity that wore trousers and owned the room. That fiery muse even inspired her to write Orlando, a literary fever dream featuring a time-traveling, gender-switching protagonist who was basically her lover in narrative cosplay. It was a book and a love letter rolled into one beautifully weird package. The muse? She was smitten too, but let's just say her calendar was busy. Lovers here, intrigues there, and a marriage she occasionally remembered she was in. Still, her letters back were laced with affection and that frustrating kind of loyalty that never quite shows up on time. "I miss you even more than I could have believed, and I was prepared to miss you a good deal," she wrote. Basically, the 1920s version of "I didn't think I'd cry at the airport, but here we are." What makes their letters sparkle isn't just the love, it's how they break the rules. These weren't loud declarations or sonnets recited on balconies. These were soft explosions on paper, coded, careful, and brimming with a longing that didn't need a body to feel real. Even after the romance cooled, the letters didn't stop. They kept writing until the very end, until that final, tragic day in 1941 when she walked into the river and into history. Everyone remembers her last letter to her husband, but the one she wrote to her muse. That's where her truest voice lived, tender, bare, unguarded. They didn't just write about love, they were love, chaotic, gorgeous, hard to categorize and always shifting, just like her prose. John Keats, romantic poet, word wizard, and the guy who gave us the immortal line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," lived fast, wrote hard, and died young. He checked out of life at just 25, but not before he poured his entire love-struck soul into a stack of heart-wrenching letters to the woman who had completely bewitched him, Fanny Brawne. Their romance, think epic poetry meets Victorian drama with a heavy dose of "I can't breathe without you." And not just because Keats had tuberculosis, although sadly he did. He fell for Fanny like a meteor, sudden, fiery, and impossible to ignore. They even got secretly engaged, though Keats had a haunting suspicion that he wouldn't live long enough to say, "I do." Cue the emotional turmoil. His letters? Oh, they were next-level swoon material. One gem reads, "I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion. I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be martyred for my religion. Love is my religion, and I could die for that. I could die for you." Yep, he wasn't just in love, he was on his knees in poetic worship. Keats called Fanny his goddess, his bright star, and when he wasn't melting into pure lyrical devotion, he was being eaten alive by jealousy and insecurity. He missed her like it was a chronic illness on top of the one he already had. Being sick only made things worse. He worried he was a burden, that she'd stop loving him, and that he'd die before ever truly being hers. Romantic, yes. Tragic, hugely. One of his most famous laments reads, "I almost wish we were butterflies and lived but 3 summer days. 3 such days with you I could fill with more delight than 50 common years could ever contain." Pass the tissues. Fanny, heartbroken but dignified, kept his letters for the rest of her life. She didn't talk much about him after he died, but she never let go of those paper time capsules. When Keats passed away in Rome in 1821, he was buried beneath a stone that didn't even bother with his name. Just a haunting line. "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." But plot twist, his name didn't vanish. His poetry stuck around. So did those love letters, each one dripping with longing, beauty, and the kind of devotion that makes modern text messages look like cave scribbles. In one letter, he wrote, "My darling Clem, I hope you'll forgive me for writing such a short note. But really, I'm so busy running the British Empire, I hardly have time to keep my head on straight." Classic understatement from a man juggling world wars like most people juggle grocery lists. His wit never took a day off, even when the world was falling apart. Throughout their long marriage, he was often off doing something casual like commanding armies, debating in Parliament, or, saving civilization. Yet his letters home were constant, his affection unshakable. He called her Cat, he signed off as Pug. Think of it as 1940s pet names meets high-stakes global diplomacy. They didn't just write like a husband and wife, They wrote like partners in crime, soulmates with matching emotional passports. Of course, they had their tiffs. In one now famous 1940 letter at the peak of the war, she gently warned him that he was getting a bit snappy with his staff. Not a scolding, more like a loving nudge with a velvet glove. His reply, grateful and sincere. He took the note and took it to heart. Their letters were a blend of battlefield strategy and flirtation, tenderness and testiness. Churchill once told her that meeting her had conquered him more completely than any campaign he'd ever fought, which, coming from a man who actually conquered things for a living, says a lot. Even near the end of his life, the notes kept coming. Sometimes short, always sincere. In a world full of generals and war rooms, his sanctuary was a quiet letter to the woman who knew the man behind the medals. No pomp, no politics, just love on paper. Sure, Churchill's legacy was built on stirring speeches and wartime grit, but his love letters, they remind us that even the toughest titans of history often kept their softest truths folded neatly in an envelope. Now, on the flip side of the R in one letter, he scribbled, "My darling Clem, I hope you'll forgive this pathetic excuse for a letter. But honestly, I'm a bit tied up at the moment, what with running the British Empire and all. I barely have time to keep my head from falling off." Yes, even with a world war thundering overhead, his sense of humour was still very much on active duty. Throughout their long marriage, Churchill was often off fighting battles, debating in Parliament, or, saving the free world. But no matter where he was, his pen never stopped moving. The letters flowed like tea at a British breakfast, and his affection for her never hit pause. He called her Cat, she called him Pug. These were not code names for a spy mission, just sweet, ridiculous nicknames exchanged between two people very much in love. Their letters weren't just sappy romantic notes. They were tactical briefings from the heart, part flirty, part strategic, all emotion. Of course, it wasn't always marital bliss and pet names. In 1940, in the middle of the war, Clementine penned a rather famous letter, gently pointing out that her dear Winston was snapping at his staff a bit too much. Something about barking at people like a bulldog with a sore tooth. She wasn't nagging, she was helping him be the leader Britain needed, and he knew it. He took it like a champ, grateful, receptive, and willing to listen. Their correspondence was a blend of romance and realism, kisses on paper punctuated with wartime advice. Churchill once told her that meeting her had conquered him more thoroughly than any battlefield ever could. A poetic mic drop from a man who literally fought in wars. Even as he aged and the speeches and salutes faded, the notes to Clementine kept coming, short, sweet, sincere. While the rest of the world saw him in uniform behind podiums, the real Winston Churchill was in those letters, vulnerable, devoted, and utterly smitten. Now, on the flip side of the love letter spectrum, we have a couple that put the chaos in romantic chaos, Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald. These two didn't just write to each other, they practically wrote through each other, like a glitter bomb of emotion exploding across the 1920s. They met in 1918. He was a young army officer with stars in his eyes and rejection letters in his pocket. She was a firecracker of a southern belle who did not come with a dimmer switch. He wooed her with letters full of charm, genius, and just a splash of panic. "I loved you the moment I saw you, and I'll love you till I drop dead." Zelda, not entirely convinced, he'd ever amount to more than a literary footnote, kept him in romantic limbo. But then his first novel hit the bestseller list in 1920, and she said, "All right, fine, let's do this." Boom. Married. Boom. Famous. Boom. Absolutely unprepared for any of it. Their letters were a cocktail of infatuation, brilliance, and impending doom. In one, Zelda chirped, "Scott, darling, I've just washed my hair and can't do a thing with it, but I love you madly." Equal parts adorable and unhinged. Her notes were dreamy, flirty, and often sprinkled with the warning signs of emotional turbulence. Scott's responses were dripping with devotion and a dash of obsession. These were two people who couldn't live without each other, but maybe shouldn't have lived with each other either. If Churchill and Clementine were a love letter in pen and ink, Zelda and Scott were one written in lipstick on a broken mirror. Two tales, two tempos, but both prove one thing. History may be made in battlefields and books, but it's remembered in the letters people write when no one's watching. He admired her beauty and fiery spirit, but he was downright terrified of her independence. Whenever she tried to write, dance, or unleash her artistic side, he'd brush her off like, "Sorry, there's only room for one writer in this family." Cue the tension dripping through their letters like a soap opera script. Love tangled up with control, affection twisted with frustration. As the years rolled on, their glamorous life didn't just sparkle, it cracked and crumbled into a mess of booze, bankruptcy, and bitterness. Zelda endured a string of mental breakdowns and spent more time in sanitariums than a regular person spends at brunch. Yet even from behind those cold walls, their letters held a weird, aching tenderness. From an asylum, she once wrote, "I've tried a million ways to write to you, tried to tell you how much I believe in you, but words just don't cut it. They never do." He died in 1940, convinced he was a failure. She met her end 8 years later, swallowed by flames in her hospital. But those letters, those fiery, wild scraps of paper, they survive. They capture two people who loved like fireworks, bright, explosive, breathtaking, and tragically doomed. A love too big, too fierce for the world they stumbled through, forever preserved in ink and ashes.